Welcome back to the CoC 201 training series. This module is going to focus all about the CoC NOFA, specifically the CoC Level Application. In a previous module, we talked about how the CoC NOFA process has two big components. One is the CoC Level Application, sometimes called the Consolidated Application, and the second is all of your projects, so your renewals, your new projects, the ranking. So we're going to talk about that first component, which is the CoC Level Application, also known as the Consolidated Application. So in that Consolidated Application, the CoC is basically telling HUD about how it's been doing in the past year in addressing homelessness. So it's a narrative application as well as certain attachments that are included. So you're talking to HUD a lot about how your CoC is coordinating with other systems, your methodology and data from your point in time and housing inventory count, information on how the CoC is working to make progress on various goals. Most of this is related to strategies that you're using to address homelessness among different subpopulations, and also how you're improving your system performance measures. A lot of how the CoC application is scored is data-driven, specifically looking at the data from the CoC system performance measures. We'll talk more about that in the upcoming slides. So the system performance measures are used by HUD to really look at how CoCs are performing year over year in addressing homelessness. The system performance measures are important because the CoC is supposed to be driving these in the right direction and making improvements on performance year over year. The SPMs are measured by using HUD data. So the data inputted by HMIS participating projects contributes to the CoC's outcomes. So many of the scoring criteria used by HUD to score the CoC application either directly or indirectly refer back to these system performance measures. So you'll see here the system performance measures that HUD looks at are length of time homeless, returns to homelessness, your overall number of homeless persons, jobs and income growth, first-time homeless, stabilizing people in homeless category 3, which is folks who are homeless by other HUD definitions. So for example, folks who are doubled up or couch surfing. HUD has not historically been looking at this in the past. And then successful placement and retention of housing. So the CoC application includes numerous questions about how the CoC is working on these areas, and HUD also looks just at the data itself. There are a number of questions in the CoC application that are specifically about how the CoC is addressing homelessness for target populations. So what is the CoC doing to address veterans homelessness, chronic homelessness, homelessness for families with children, youth, and all other folks who are experiencing homelessness. So the categories that HUD uses in scoring the CoC NOFA consolidated application are project ranking, review and capacity, system performance, HMIS, point in time count, performance and strategic planning, and CoC coordination and engagement. You'll see here, this chart shows the maximum eligible score for each of these categories from 2016 to 2019. You'll see HUD has been increasing the points for system performance year over year. And these are those data-driven measures. So what does the data say? HUD has also been increasing the points around CoC coordination and engagement. So how are you working with other systems to address homelessness? For example, how are you working with your local PHAs, public housing authorities? And then some of the areas have been de-emphasized over the years, such as performance and strategic planning. HUD has really shown through how they're scoring the NOFA consolidated application that they're really interested in the data, what the data says, rather than just the CoCs explaining what their strategies are. So we're going to take each of those categories and just break it down for you what HUD is looking for. So this is based on the 2019 NOFA, which as of the recording of this webinar was the most recent NOFA information we have available. So project ranking, review, and capacity. This looks at whether your CoC has an objective process for ranking your renewal projects. So are you using objective criteria? Are you looking at data around past performance? Are you looking at severity of need in terms of how you're calculating your scoring? Reallocating projects. HUD wants to see that COCs are reallocating projects and funding the most effective projects. And HUD actually looks at what percentage have you reallocated over a certain number of years. That can either be voluntary or involuntary reallocation. And then your ranking and selection process. Do you have a transparent process for how you are ranking projects? System performance, again, these are very data-driven areas, and this is worth the highest amount of points on the consolidated application. So HUD looks at how are you reducing the number of homeless individuals and families year over year? So this is mostly looking at your point in time count and what's happening with sheltered and unsheltered homelessness. HUD looks at whether you're reducing the number of people who are homeless for the first time. HUD looks at the length of time homeless. And you'll see here, HUD wants to see a pretty significant improvement year over year. For example, they want to see a 5% decrease in your PIT count. They want to see a 5% decrease in your length of time homeless in order to get maximum points. HUD looks at successful permanent housing placement or retention. So what percentage of folks are exiting to permanent housing or for PSH are also being retained in permanent housing. HUD looks at your returns to homelessness within 6 to 12 months, jobs and income growth. So this looks at both increasing your employment income and your non-employment income. And also HUD looks at your system performance measures and whether they were submitted in a timely fashion. HUD does look at HMIS information. They want to know that your HIC, your housing inventory count, was submitted on time. They look at your bed coverage. So what this means is, of all of the homeless dedicated projects in your CoC, what percentage of them are participating in HMIS? And HUD wants to see at least 85% coverage. This is an area of improvement for the Eastern PA CoC, as there are a number of homeless dedicated projects that are not participating in HMIS. HUD also looks at whether your longitudinal system analysis, your LSA, was submitted on time. HUD looks at the point in time count. So what was your methodology and did you submit the data on time? HUD also wants to know what strategies you're using to effectively count youth. HUD looks at performance and strategic planning. So they look at your efforts to end chronic homelessness, both whether you're seeing a decrease year over year and also whether you're prioritizing all of your beds for folks who are, all of your permanent supportive housing beds for folks who are chronically homeless. HUD wants to see what strategies you're using to end homelessness among households with children. So how are you prioritizing households with children based on need? What is your rapid rehousing strategy for families? And then also, how are you decreasing family homelessness over time? There's also some pieces about whether projects are HUD has some requirements about what kind of operations family projects have. So one is that family projects should not be denying admission to or separating family members, for example, based on age or gender. So you can't have a project that is, for example, not accepting an older teen who's 16 and over, or separating two parents from one another, for example, because of gender. HUD also wants to see that you're providing educational services to families with children 0 to 5. So specifically, how are you coordinating with early education, for example? HUD wants to know what your strategy is for ending youth homelessness. So how are you prioritizing youth based on need? How are you addressing the unique circumstances and needs of unaccompanied homeless youth? For example, how is your coordinated entry system accessible to youth and addressing the needs of youth? Are you increasing the availability of housing and services for youth year over year? And how are you collaborating with education providers? So for example, your McKinney-Vento liaisons, your school districts. HUD looks at what your efforts are around addressing veterans' homelessness. And this is specifically looking at the point in time count. Are you seeing a decrease in veterans experiencing homelessness year over year? And lastly, HUD looks at CoC coordination and engagement. So HUD looks to see whether you have an inclusive CoC participation structure. So for example, hosting your CoC meetings, inviting new members to join the CoC. Are your services accessible to folks? For example, folks who may have disabilities. How are you making sure that your system is accessible? Are you coordinating with federal, state, local, private, and other organizations? How are you addressing the needs of victims of domestic violence? Are you protecting against discrimination? So what are your strategies in your CoC to do so? For example, are you facilitating trainings for folks on equal access rules? Public housing agencies, HUD wants to know how you're coordinating with public housing agencies, and also whether any of your public housing agencies have a homeless preference. So HUD wants to see that CoCs are leveraging PHA resources to serve folks experiencing homelessness. HUD looks at what your discharge planning strategies are from other public systems. So how are you working, for example, with the foster care system or the criminal justice system around discharge planning from systems of care? And HUD also looks at low barriers to entry. So are your projects operating with minimal barriers for folks who need the services? And then also wants to know your street outreach strategy. A few other things that HUD looks at with CoC coordination engagement. Are you working with your local communities to ensure that people experiencing homelessness are not criminalized? Rapid rehousing is specifically looking at, are you increasing your rapid rehousing beds year over year? Mainstream benefits, so how are you connecting folks with mainstream benefits? HUD has questions about your coordinated entry system. HUD has been asking for the past couple of years about how you are addressing racial disparities in homelessness. So are you assessing your system for racial disparities? And then what are you doing about it? HUD wants to know how you're increasing employment for people experiencing homelessness and how you're promoting volunteering and community service. And lastly, if two CoCs do a merger, which is not very common, but does happen where maybe two small CoCs merge together, there's a bonus for that. So as you can see, there are a lot of different things that HUD looks at in your CoC consolidated application. And these are all things that CoCs should be working on throughout the year as part of their strategic plan. So hopefully this is helpful context so that you know how the CoC is being assessed by HUD year over year through the CoC NOFA competition. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back to talk about the CoC NOFA renewals, new projects, and ranking.